Welcome to D2 Global News. Imagine this. Amid the fire and smoke of war and the exhausting efforts of reconstruction, an unexpected financial bomb goes off. That is the $120 billion debt repayment demand that Washington sent to Kyiv. An ally demanding repayment from an ally struggling to fight a war. What is really going on behind this seemingly cold move? Is this merely an economic issue? Or are there deeper geopolitical calculations? Hidden shifts in the relationship between the two nations? Is the ultimatum from Ukraine a desperate cry for help? Or a strategic counterstrike forcing the US to reconsider its role and responsibility? Let's join D2 Global News in uncovering the secrets behind this shocking debt demand and the unforeseeable consequences it may bring. Before diving into the main content, please hit like, share, and subscribe to support us. Now, let's begin. The recent demand from the United States for Ukraine to repay $120 billion in aid has caused a wave of concern and speculation around the world. This move, occurring amid an ongoing conflict and Ukraine's massive reconstruction needs, has the potential to reshape the relationship between the two countries and create far-reaching geopolitical consequences. The fact that the United States, one of Ukraine's largest donors since Russia's invasion in February 2022, suddenly made this request indicates a potential shift in Washington's policy or priorities toward Kyiv. The response from Ukraine, described as an ultimatum, shows the complexity and sensitivity of this issue for Kyiv, a country struggling with serious economic and humanitarian challenges caused by war. This issue not only affects the future of the US-Ukraine bilateral relationship but also has significant impacts on Western unity and the global balance of power. So, before diving into complicated calculations, do we really understand what this enormous $120 billion aid package truly is? And whether that number accurately reflects the full picture of Washington's support for Kyiv? To better understand this repayment demand, it is important to closely examine the components of the aid package that the United States has provided to Ukraine. Since Russia launched a full-scale invasion in February 2022, the U.S. Congress has passed 5 major bills providing aid to Ukraine, with a total approved budget reaching $175 billion by April 2024. Of this, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, approximately $128 billion was transferred directly to the Ukrainian government. However, the $120 billion figure mentioned in the repayment demand is nearly equivalent to the Kiel Institute's estimate of direct aid to the Ukrainian government. Yet, is this number a rigid figure, or merely a starting point for complex political bargaining, especially when former President Donald Trump had once proposed a figure as high as $350 billion? This discrepancy shows the complexity of tracking international aid and the potential for political factors to influence how these numbers are presented. U.S. aid to Ukraine can be divided into various categories. The largest portion is military aid, including weapons, equipment, training, and intelligence. The main mechanisms for providing military aid include the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI, Presidential Drawdown Authority, PDA, and the Foreign Military Financing Program, FMF. For example, in September 2024, the Department of Defense announced its intention to withdraw approximately $5.55 billion in defense goods and services from reserves to provide military aid to Ukraine under the PDA. In addition, the U.S. also provides direct financial support to the Ukrainian government to maintain essential services, implement anti-corruption programs, and repair damaged infrastructure. Another significant portion is humanitarian aid, aimed at supporting refugees, internally displaced persons, and addressing other humanitarian needs caused by the war. Regarding the terms of the aid, what makes the repayment demand especially controversial? Is it because most of the U.S. aid has been provided in the form of non-repayable grants? However, there are also some forms of aid with conditions. By the end of 2024, the U.S. had provided the Ukrainian government with a $20 billion loan, funded by interest earned from frozen Russian assets. Furthermore, the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act, signed in May 2022, allows the U.S. military to provide equipment to Ukraine and other Eastern European countries on a loan basis. This law requires repayment but has indefinitely postponed Ukraine's debt repayment. Although the law mandates repayment, there is currently no specific timeline established. There are also claims that some aid from European countries was provided in the form of loans. Differences in reported aid figures show the complexity of tracking international support and the potential for varying political interpretations of the actual scale of assistance. The fact that most U.S. aid is in the form of non-repayable grants contradicts a direct debt repayment demand, suggesting that the $120 billion figure may refer to a specific subset of aid, e.g. loans or projected future costs, or be a politically motivated expression. As the veil over the $120 billion figure is partially lifted, a more pressing question arises. What are the real motivations, economic, political, or strategic, behind this somewhat unexpected and sensitive demand from Washington? The U.S. demand for Ukraine to repay such a massive aid package may stem from a combination of economic, political, and strategic motivations. Economically, is the growing burden of national debt forcing Washington to tighten its belt. Even with strategic allies like Ukraine, the recovery of public funds could be seen as a way to reduce debt burdens or to satisfy demands from certain voters or political figures for balanced international spending. However, it should be noted that a significant portion of the aid has been spent in the U.S., funding American factories and workers producing the weapons sent to Ukraine or replenishing U.S. weapons stockpiles. The fact that a large amount of aid money is spent domestically lessens the perception of a complete financial outflow, potentially influencing domestic political discourse on aid. Could emphasizing these domestic economic benefits be a way to ease concerns over international spending? Politically, the domestic political landscape in the U.S., especially comments from Donald Trump, who has openly stated that Ukraine should repay the aid and even suggested a deal involving mineral extraction rights as compensation, may play an important role. These statements could pressure the current administration to take a tougher stance on aid. Furthermore, there is a possibility that U.S. foreign policy priorities are shifting, especially with changes in administration or developments in the domestic political context. Some even argue that Ukraine has not shown sufficient gratitude for the support from the U.S. From a strategic perspective, the debt repayment request could be a tool for the U.S. to exert influence over Ukraine in future negotiations, potentially related to post-conflict reconstruction, reforms, or strategic alignment. Additionally, the U.S. may want to encourage European allies to contribute more financially to supporting Ukraine. It is noteworthy that some sources indicate Europe has provided more aid than the U.S. The claim that Europe has given more aid challenges the notion that the U.S. is bearing the main financial burden, potentially weakening America's justification for demanding immediate repayment. If Europe's contribution is indeed higher, the U.S. request might be more about political signaling or burden sharing for the future, rather than simply recovering past costs. This also highlights potential tensions within the Western alliance. Ultimately, there may be a connection between the debt repayment demand and the proposed agreement for access to Ukraine's mineral resources. This could be seen as an alternative form of repayment, treating access to mineral resources as repayment aligns with a transactional approach to foreign policy, potentially prioritizing tangible economic interests over traditional geopolitical considerations. Facing what seems to be a highly challenging demand from its largest ally, what strategic moves might Kyiv make to both protect its national interests and maintain international support? Ukraine is facing an extremely difficult economic situation due to the devastation of war. GDP has dropped significantly. Infrastructure has been heavily damaged, with reconstruction needs estimated at $524 billion over the next decade. And poverty is rising. Rebuilding the country is a massive task, requiring heavy reliance on international financial support. Notably, there is still a significant financial gap for the year 2025. Ukraine's economy continues to be disrupted, including damage to energy infrastructure and labor shortages. In this precarious situation, how can Kyiv respond to the enormous debt repayment demand? In this context, Ukraine has many reasons to oppose immediate repayment. The Ukrainian government may argue that U.S. aid is crucial for defending against Russian aggression, viewing it as an investment in the collective security of the West rather than a simple financial transaction. Could President Zelensky's strong stance, that future generations should not bear the burden of this aid, be compelling enough to sway Washington? Furthermore, Ukraine may argue that a demand for repayment could set a negative precedent for other aid-receiving nations. Strategically, what cards does Kyiv have to play at the negotiation table? Can they leverage their geopolitical importance to secure continued support and negotiate favorable debt restructuring terms? They may also capitalize on their strategic value to the West to ensure continued support and avoid immediate repayment. Ukraine has shown willingness to discuss a potential mineral resource agreement as a compromise while simultaneously seeking security guarantees. However, Ukraine has rejected initial unfavorable terms. Ukraine's firm demand for security guarantees alongside any resource deal highlights their understanding that economic agreements must not undermine their long-term sovereignty and survival. This underscores the connection between economic and security concerns for Ukraine. They may be able to use the mineral deal as a bargaining chip to secure not only financial benefits but also firm security commitments from the US. Could linking economic interests, such as mineral resources, with security needs be Ukraine's smartest move right now? To better understand the current situation, comparing it to similar historical cases may offer insights and highlight potential pitfalls. First is the Marshall Plan. Post-World War II, the U.S. provided massive aid to Western Europe, mostly in the form of non-repayable grants or concessional loans, with the strategic goal of reconstruction and preventing Soviet influence. The Marshall Plan set a historical precedent where post-conflict aid was strategically designed to serve broader geopolitical objectives, with financial recovery tied to security interests. This historical example suggests that America's approach to Ukraine should consider the long-term strategic benefits of a stable and prosperous Ukraine in resisting Russian aggression, rather than focusing solely on immediate financial returns. Second is the Latin American debt crisis, 1980s. Large-scale borrowing countries failed to repay as interest rates soared, leading to harsh IMF, World Bank austerity programs under U.S. influence and prolonged instability. This historical case serves as a warning about the potential negative consequences of imposing strict debt repayment terms on a country facing severe economic hardship, which could lead to instability and hinder long-term recovery. Forcing Ukraine into a similar situation could undermine its reconstruction efforts, cause social unrest, and potentially leave it more vulnerable to outside influence, contrary to Western strategic goals. Third is Germany's war reparations, post-World War I. The overwhelming burden of reparations imposed on Germany after World War I devastated its economy and contributed to the rise of extremism. This historical example highlights the danger of demanding financial obligations beyond a country's ability to pay, with the potential for serious political and geopolitical repercussions. The US and its allies should avoid repeating this mistake with Ukraine by ensuring that any financial expectations are realistic and do not destabilize the country or the broader region. From past lessons and present complexities, what scenarios could shape the future of the US-Ukraine relationship and the fate of the $120 billion debt? Scenario 1 is debt restructuring negotiations. The US, Ukraine, and allies along with international financial institutions may come together to negotiate. The outcome could involve extending repayment terms, reducing interest rates, granting long grace periods, converting part of the debt into non-repayable aid, or conditional investment projects. This scenario reflects the most pragmatic approach, balancing U.S. demands for accountability with Ukraine's economic reality and the broader strategic interests of the West. Restructuring would allow Ukraine to manage its debt burden while still receiving necessary financial support for reconstruction and defense. It also avoids the negative consequences of default or a total breakdown in relations. Is this the most pragmatic path? Balancing accountability with economic and strategic realities. Scenario 2. The U.S. holds a hardline stance. Washington may refuse to make significant concessions, putting maximum pressure on Kyiv. What would the consequences be? Could Ukraine face the risk of default, internal instability, delayed reconstruction, and a rift with the U.S., forcing stronger EU intervention? Ukraine could face default or be forced to implement extreme economic measures, leading to internal unrest, slowed reconstruction, and damage to US-Ukraine relations. The EU may have to intervene more forcefully to prevent a full-blown crisis. A hardline US stance could backfire, undermining Ukraine's stability and potentially weakening Western unity against Russia. This scenario risks creating more problems than it solves, possibly resulting in a more unstable and vulnerable Ukraine, detrimental to US and allied strategic interests. Scenario 3. Ukraine achieves a diplomatic victory. A strong response and effective diplomatic lobbying from Ukraine could lead the US to reconsider, resulting in highly favorable repayment terms, including partial debt forgiveness or new security aid commitments. Although less likely, this scenario underscores Ukraine's potential influence due to its geopolitical importance and the moral arguments surrounding its situation. If Ukraine can effectively communicate its contribution to Western security and the severe economic consequences of immediate repayment, it may shift international opinion and result in more lenient terms. Scenario 4. A prolonged stalemate. Neither side backs down, and the debt issue becomes a persistent source of tension, negatively impacting bilateral cooperation and Western unity. Who stands to gain from this uncertainty? And could it weaken the West's unified response? A prolonged stalemate would create uncertainty and hinder effective planning for Ukraine's reconstruction and long-term security. This scenario benefits no one, generating a long-term friction point that adversaries could exploit, weakening the West's coordinated response to the conflict. But does this debt story end with Washington and Kyiv, or will the ripple effects of this decision spread, reshaping the geopolitical landscape, allied trust, and even the global balance of power? The debt issue between the US and Ukraine has much broader implications than just bilateral relations. A stance perceived as harsh in demanding repayment from a nation under attack could damage the United States' credibility as a reliable ally. This could have ramifications for future US foreign policy and its ability to build and maintain alliances. Disagreements over financial aid to Ukraine could also create tension in US-European relations. Notably, the European Union, EU, has made significant financial contributions to Ukraine, even surpassing US aid in certain aspects. The EU's strong commitment to Ukraine, including long-term efforts toward EU membership, suggests a potential for more balanced financial burden sharing within the Western alliance. This could reduce the negative impact of a diminished US role. But it also raises questions about the future direction of transatlantic relations and the division of responsibilities in supporting Ukraine. Any divisions in the Western alliance could be exploited by adversaries. How this debt issue is handled could also impact the global balance of power by shaping perceptions of the West's commitment to supporting democracies under attack. It may also influence other countries receiving US aid in their future relationships with Washington. Amid potential crossroads and unpredictable consequences, is there an honorable way out? A specific solution being considered to break the deadlock, such as a deal to extract Ukraine's valuable mineral resources. One potential aspect to resolve the debt issue is the proposed agreement for US investment and access to Ukraine's mineral resources. This agreement has evolved from an initial proposal to grant the US $500 billion worth of mineral extraction rights as a form of repayment into a joint investment fund between the US and Ukraine. Under this agreement, Ukraine would contribute 50% of the revenue from the extraction of state-owned natural resource assets to this fund. The fund would be reinvested in projects in Ukraine to further develop these assets. Ukraine has expressed willingness to discuss this agreement while seeking security guarantees and rejecting terms that could burden future generations. Ukraine's critical mineral resources are strategically important to the US, especially amid competition with China. Ukraine holds estimated reserves of lithium and titanium among the largest in Europe, along with significant cobalt and nickel deposits. The mineral resource agreement could benefit both sides, serving America's strategic interests in critical minerals while offering Ukraine a path toward economic recovery and a way to repay without immediate financial strain. However, the success of this agreement depends on fair terms, security guarantees for Ukraine, and the ability to attract private investment in a challenging security environment. It is crucial that this agreement is structured fairly to avoid undermining Ukraine's sovereignty and long-term economic development. So, after analyzing every angle, from the nature of the aid to each side's motivations, from historical lessons to future scenarios and potential solutions, what balance must be struck between harsh financial realities and urgent strategic imperatives in this challenging US-Ukraine partnership? The US demand for Ukraine to repay $120 billion in aid is a complex issue with many economic, political, and strategic dimensions, while the US has legitimate concerns about financial accountability and domestic pressures. Ukraine faces serious economic challenges caused by war and argues that US support is an investment in collective security. Solving this issue requires a balanced approach that considers Ukraine's economic vulnerabilities and its strategic role amid Russian aggression. Debt restructuring negotiations are likely the most realistic path, enabling Ukraine to manage its financial obligations while still receiving vital support for reconstruction and defense. The proposed mineral resource agreement also presents a potential solution to address the debt while serving America's strategic interests in critical minerals. Ultimately, The future of US-Ukraine financial relations will depend on the ability of both countries to balance financial realities with strategic imperatives. Maintaining a strong and stable Ukraine is crucial for regional security and the global balance of power. And resolving this debt issue will play a vital role in shaping the trajectory of this important partnership. Continued international cooperation, especially from European allies, will also be essential in supporting Ukraine's recovery and long-term security. Thank you for watching the entire video. What do you think about this issue? Leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated with our latest content. Warm regards and goodbye.